it's actually important to consider why people are looking for indices and what they're intending to do with them. And I can understand that people would be looking to compare vessels from vessel to vessel. And that's fine, but in shipping, you need to actually look at comparing apples with apples. And when you have cars, you look at emissions from cars, for example, they have a certain rating when they come out of the factory, and then once a year they get tested. And they get tested under garage conditions, so they get put onto a belt, and they do, I don't know what they're exactly testing, but they have specific parameters. With ships, what we're trying to do with these indices is actually comparing them when they're running. And if I take my car example, if I have the same car and I look at me driving it and my brother driving it, the emissions would be very different. And with ships, it's the same thing. It depends on how you use a vessel as to how much energy you're going to use with it, how much fuel you're going to burn. And the indices that are used today have great difficulty actually normalizing those parameters. And I mean, as INTERTANKO, our members are tanker owners, which traditionally have long voyages in ballast, where they actually drive around empty. And they try and triangulate, they try and minimize those. But if you look at the overall energy efficiency for cargo carried, for example, it depends on the trade pattern. And that's just a nature of what we do. So it's not something they do on purpose. They don't drive around looking for a job. They drive around because they need to pick up the next cargo. And crude oil only exists in certain parts of the world. So it's a natural measure of how the trade works. So having a simplistic index that simply looks at how much fuel you burn per ton of cargo carried doesn't really work. And that's, I think, what we need to refine. Because most of these indices, people are just looking for a quick fix. They want to have decision-making tools that they can just look at and get an indication. And if they're aware of the limitations of those, it's fine. But unfortunately, people often just go for the quick fix solution. They go, okay, is it more or less efficient per ton mile, for example? And then, of course, it stops working. And one thing that we found with our members in particular, we do a lot of monitoring of fuels burned, for example. We look at comparing the fleet within the membership. And what we find is that sometimes we have maybe 6 or 7 sister ships. It's a recent case. 6 or 7 sister ships that were coming from the same yard. They're nearly identical, but their energy efficiency was completely different. Despite the fact that they were actually fitted with similar resources, they were fitted with similar measures to try and improve efficiency. But the weather was different en route. Maybe the routing was slightly different. There's tiny differences which make a huge effect ultimately on what they're burning in terms of fuel. And I think we have made huge steps forward. I mean, people are looking at, for example, the EEOI energy efficiency. If you know what you're doing, you can use it to compare certain parameters. But in general, it isn't an easy comparison. It's not something that you can simply calculate and then say, well, it's 6 versus 3. It isn't that simple. And that's the difficulty with shipping. So I'm sure that these indices will develop. I'm sure we'll see more of them. We'll see them getting more sophisticated. What's very important, I think, for me as a scientist is that we don't end up with a black box. Because there's too many models out there already where you put information in at one end, you get something out at the other end, you have no idea what happens in the middle. And if the algorithms that they're using are not sound, then the outcome will be rubbish. And that's what we don't want. And I think if you look at seafarers today, most of them are highly trained professionals. And like anybody in the world today, they are affected by having much easier access to information. So they have a much better understanding of environmental issues in general. They are sensitized from the word go, like all of us, through the fact that the internet actually makes information easily available. You don't need to be a biologist today to understand how certain ecological systems work. You don't have to be particularly interested in the ecology to have seen David Attenborough on television or something. So I think the understanding is increasing anyway, and I think regulation plays the smallest part. Regulation focuses the mind on specific issues that the regulators or the countries that actually sit in these regulatory bodies focus on at the time being. So ballast water, for example, is an issue that people have focused on because of specific issues that came up in a number of countries like Australia and Canada. And now the awareness is there. It's taken a number of years to raise that, but it didn't come through regulation because, as you know, the convention isn't enforced yet to deal with it. So I think, yes, attitudes are changing willingly because humans tend to be interested in understanding what's going on around them. So I have every sympathy for people saying, oh, yeah, we need to force people to understand more. But I think actually what we need to do is make information available and then put systems in place that can actually make it easy for people to do the right thing. And if we explain what the right thing is, they don't have a problem with that. I think also looking back, the problem with environmental issues today is they're becoming more complex. If you look maybe 10 years ago at shipping and you looked at what the environmental issue in shipping was oil pollution. It was visible and you knew what the answer was. The answer was don't pollute, don't put it in there. Very simple. Of course we can fix that very easily and much more easily than if you look at today where we're saying, oh, we have an issue with greenhouse gases. Okay, so we're saying, right, greenhouse gases, we need to reduce CO2. So everyone says, well, let's move to LNG then, that's great. But if you look at what LNG actually is methane. And methane as a gas has a much higher greenhouse gas potential than CO2. So when we're trying to reduce CO2, are we putting more methane into the atmosphere? It doesn't make any sense. And that's why I think with that complexity comes the uncertainty where people are starting to stall and are saying, well, I don't know what's right anymore. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. One person's telling me one thing, the other another. Where do I need to actually act? And what do I need to change? That's what makes it complicated. Well, I think, as we've just said, I think energy efficiency obviously is on everybody's mind, and it's linked to so many things. It's linked commercially simply to the fuel prices. It's linked to the fact that we don't want to spill that stuff anymore because we understand it's a finite resource. It's also linked to understand how it affects the globe in general. So the whole issue of climate change and all those things that are still in flux today. And I think, as we've just said before, environmental issues for shipping used to be very simple. It was about pollution from ships, and that was pretty much it. Today, it's about effluents, air emissions. It's about a whole host of other things that are still coming. It's about noise, for example. So I think we are looking much more holistically at how ships move in the marine environment, what they do to the marine environment, and what we can do to minimize the impact from that. I mean, if you look at some of the leisure industries, for example, diving, they have this nice little slogan which says, leave only bubbles. When you're going diving on some sensitive environment. I think with shipping, we're probably moving in the same direction. We're looking at ways of absolutely minimizing to the absolute bare minimum what we're doing today with shipping, what impacts we're going to have.